You may have been watching the Star's historical drama, The Serpent Queen, and you find yourself wondering what's true and what actually happened in the chronicles of history. There is lots of intrigue in the show, lots of events, and of course, fictionalized versions of those events. But don't despair. This video will give you the historically true and chronological history of Catherine de Medici's life story. Let's begin. Catherine de Medici was born on April 13, 1519, in Florence, Italy, to Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino, and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a relative of King Francis I of France. Lorenzo de Medici was merely a commoner, but Madeleine was of noble birth, being the daughter of a count and duchess. Their marriage in 1518 was a political agreement between the king and Pope Leo X, who was head of the Catholic Church at the time. Pope Leo just happened to be of the Medici family, and as the head of the Catholic Church and ruler of the Papal States, he promised to support Francis's claim to the throne in exchange for Francis's promise to ensure that the Vatican would have full authority over the Catholic Church in France. Catherine was the only child of Lorenzo and Madeleine, who are said to have been elated at her birth and looking forward to raising their child, but both of Catherine's parents died within a month of her birth. Her father from syphilis and her mother from either the same affliction or perhaps from the plague. Baby Catherine was taken in by her paternal grandmother, Alfonsina Orsini, who herself managed to die shortly afterwards, so little Catherine was shuttled off to an aunt to be cared for, but that didn't last. Little Catherine jumped around from family member to family member for the first years of her life, but by 1523, everything was about to change. When another of her Medici relatives was elected pope, this time Giulio de' Medici, who became known as Pope Clement VII in 1523. He decided Catherine would be a good political asset and had the young preteen installed in the family palace. The Medici family was wealthy and prosperous, by this time having made their fortune in banking. The wealth of the Medici family allowed them access to political power in Florence, even though they were not regarded as equals by the aristocracy, which made them all that more determined to gain power in any way that they could. But alas, in 1527, the Medici family's power came crashing down. They were ousted from Florence, and 8-year-old Catherine spent 3 years living in convents, with her life threatened at times due to her family name, until the Pope called her to Rome in 1530 to arrange her marriage. Clement VII saw this as an opportunity for a Medici to rise to aristocracy when King Francis I of France offered his son Henry in 1533 in marriage to Catherine. So, of course, he accepted. 14-year-old Catherine married 14-year-old Henry in October of that same year. Although Henry played the part of the groom, as was expected of him, at the wedding and during the wedding night, in truth, Henry had absolutely no interest in Catherine and spent most nights with his mistresses and eventually, or right from the start according to some sources, with his main love interest, Diane de Poitiers. Diane was everything Catherine was not. She was supremely self-confident and beautiful, an aristocrat whose parents had encouraged her athletic interests and education in a wide array of subjects, including architecture and the law. She was also independently wealthy since, after the death of her husband, she had made use of her legal skills to retain his estate without the requirement of a male consort supervisor. Catherine was queen in name only. She had no political power and no influence over the king or the court. She was distrusted by the courtiers as a foreigner and shunned as a commoner. Further complicating her position, she seemed unable to conceive a child. In 1536, Henry's older brother Francis died of fever and Henry became heir to the throne. It was now more important than ever that Catherine give Henry a child, and so she took to folk remedies to increase fertility, such as placing cow dung on her source of life, if you know what I mean, and drinking animal urine. She consulted astrologers and folk healers, and later the physician and seer Nostradamus, who she elevated to the position of chief physician for her son Charles IX. Her association with astrology, which the church condemned, as well as with folk remedies, Nostradamus and others like him, is the source of the later claim that she was involved in occult practices. At the same time, however, she was also suspected of being a witch because of her inability to conceive. The proper function of a woman was understood to be childbearing. and those who could not conceive were apt to raise suspicions of witchery because witches were understood to be in league with the devil, who could not generate life, and so were infertile. Catherine was never charged with witchcraft, but there were suggestions by the nobility that the king should divorce her. Henry, meanwhile, was spending his nights with Diane. Diane had been a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude of France, Henry's mother, who died when he was young, and she seems to have been seen as a mother figure by him at an early age. As his lover, she was the most powerful woman in France, but she encouraged his relationship with Catherine, and especially that he spend more time in Catherine's bedchamber than her own, to co-create an heir to the throne. Catherine gave birth to her first son, Francis II, in 1544, and afterwards found no difficulty in conceiving further, eventually giving birth to 10 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood or young adulthood. Catherine had 15 good years of marriage with Henry, and she had truly fallen in love with her husband, in spite of the fact that he never gave up Diane as his mistress. But as with so many of the good moments in Catherine's life, it came to an abrupt end. In 1559, Henry II arranged a marriage between his daughter Elizabeth of Valois to King Philip II of Spain. The marriage celebration included jousting tournaments, a sport Henry was especially skilled in and proud of. When he was unseated by his opponent, the Comte de Montgomery, he called for a rematch, during which Montgomery's lance shattered against Henry's helmet, sending shards of wood into his eye and forehead. The wood penetrated into his brain, and he lived a little over 2 weeks before succumbing to the injury. Throughout this time, Catherine remained by his side, and although he called for Diane de Poitiers, Catherine denied her entrance to the chamber. Some call Catherine cruel because of this, but I totally side with Catherine. After Henry's death, Catherine chose to dress in black, for the custom was that widows could wear either white or black, and she took the broken lance as her own personal symbol for the next phase of her life. Upon the death of Henry II, his 15-year-old son was crowned King Francis II. Francis could legally rule on his own, but he knew he wasn't up to it and bowed to his mother's authority as the now Queen Regent. They commenced to issue decrees jointly, with Catherine's name coming noticeably to the forefront. Catherine established herself as the power behind Francis II, but not without competition for this newly gained power. Not surprisingly, the idea of a woman having too much power and ruling a country was, dare I say, feared, and most certainly despised by everyone of that time period. As events go, the new King Francis was to inherit, along with the throne, his father's 2 trusted advisors who were both French Protestants who followed the reformist John Calvin. At that time, these Protestants were commonly called Huguenots. But the Catholics wanted their religion to be the one that France adopted. So along came 2 Catholic brothers known as the Dukes of Guise, or let's just call them the Guise brothers. They opposed the Huguenots taking hold in the country, and they were of a noble family, so they had some leverage to work their own way into the monarchy. The Guise brothers, with their personal agenda, stepped in and quickly isolated Francis II from his father's Protestant advisors. Catherine just as quickly recognized the threat the Guise posed and diplomatically invited them to instruct and counsel her son, moving herself into the background as Queen Regent, but still maintaining her influence over her inexperienced son, the king. Now, here is where it gets really messy. Lots of intrigue mixed up with the religious wars of 16th century France, along with murder and mayhem. In 1560, a group of Protestants planned to kidnap Francis II to rescue him from the Guises' influence, but the plot, known as the Amboise Conspiracy, was discovered and the participants jailed or executed. Tensions throughout the country continued until 1562, when Francis, Duke of Guise, slaughtered members of a Protestant congregation in the Massacre of Vassy and set off the French Wars of Religion. In the same year, Catherine lost her son Francis II to an ear infection, and her second son, Charles IX, became King of France at the tender age of 9. This presented a problem when a competing royal household known as the Bourbon, or as we say, the Bourbons, just like the whiskey, were eager to step in and present their son, Antoine de Bourbon, as regent, since Charles was not of mature age to rule. But the Bourbons had a relative by the name of Louis de Bourbon, who had been arrested after the Amboise conspiracy and slated for execution. This was leverage for Catherine to trade the life of Louis de Bourbon for Antoine's renunciation of his claim as regent, and so she was able to maintain her position as Queen Regent. Another of Catherine's problems resolved itself when Francis, Duke of Guise, was assassinated in 1563, thereby loosening the hold the Guise had on the throne. This allowed Catherine to assert more control over Charles IX and ensure her hold on the power of the throne. One thing that is often overlooked in the history of Catherine de Medici is that she worked hard to bring peace to France while the wars of religion were raging around her and her son's kingdom. One instance where she demonstrated her interest in reconciling Protestants and Catholics was when she met with the Queen of Navarre, who you remember was a Protestant, to reach some sort of compromise and end the battles if possible. When these efforts failed, she had her son, King Charles IX, contact representatives of the Ottoman Empire with a plan to relocate, or one could say, displace, Protestant French to Ottoman Moldavia, which is now part of Romania, but there was no incentive given and the Ottomans rejected the proposal. In 1567, Charles IX was ambushed by Protestant forces in what is known as the Surprise of Meaux, which he and Catherine barely escaped. And so it was at this point that she then abandoned hopes of reconciliation in the War of Religions and, according to some historians, began formulating a plan to execute the Protestants leading the revolt against the Catholics. This claim has been challenged, although there is evidence that Catholic nobles had suggested such a plan as early as 1560 or earlier, and it seems likely that Catherine would have been aware of it, even if she did not conceive of it herself. Since one of the most powerful Protestant leaders, Louis de Bourbon, had been executed after surrendering in 1569, and the Protestant Queen Jeanne d'Albret of Navarre was untouchable in her stronghold of La Rochelle, it was devised that the most accessible target for assassination was the Protestant and former advisor to King Henry II, Gaspard de Coligny, Admiral of France. Now that the target was identified, all that was left was to arrange the time and place. The story goes like this. Catherine proposed to the Protestant Queen Jeanne d'Albret the marriage of her daughter Margaret to the Queen's son Henry as part of the intricate plot to lure the leading Protestants to Paris for execution, although in truth there is no historical evidence to support this story. The wedding was set for August 18th of that same year and drew Protestants from all over the country to Catholic Paris. The Protestant leaders, including Admiral Coligny, were all housed in a specific area of Paris, and 3 days after the wedding, an assassination attempt was made on Coligny as he returned to his apartment. He was wounded in his hand and arm by gunshot and was carried to his chambers. The would-be assassin was never identified. And this is where things really got out of hand. The Protestants suspected the French crown of complicity in the assassination attempt, and Charles IX and Catherine, fearing they would be attacked, ordered a preemptive strike, which would become a terrible day in France known as the Saint Bartholomew's Day Massacre. On the night of August 23rd, it was decided that all of the Protestant leaders should be eliminated, and the massacre began the next morning with the accomplished murder of Coligny, who was killed in his apartment, thrown out the window, and decapitated. The other leaders were quickly slaughtered, and although Charles IX then called for restraint and an end to the violence, the common people took to the streets, hunting down Protestants and Protestant sympathizers and killing them. News of the massacre spread, and more Protestants were murdered in other cities and towns throughout France, resulting in a death toll in the thousands, with a low count at around 5,000, but more likely over 25,000 or more killed on that day. Needless to say, the marriage of Henry of Navarre and Margaret failed spectacularly in achieving the hoped-for peace and reconciliation intended. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre encouraged the same level of violence that would spread throughout the rest of the country, resulting in a France divided between the largely Catholic population of the north and the Protestants in the south. The religious wars of France raged on with Catherine still squarely at the helm of the monarchy, beside her son, Charles IX. Catherine's daughter Margaret, also known as Margot of Valois or Marguerite de Valois, would also become a major player in the wars of religion as well as the royal history of France. She too was a much maligned queen whose true story needs to be told, so you can bet that I have a video on her life story as well. Now back to Catherine de Medici and how she continues to hold her power for a time, even through the death of yet another son king. France was now divided between a Catholic North and Protestant South. Henry of Navarre had managed to escape execution in the massacre by falsely promising to convert to Catholicism and then took command of Protestant forces with Henry I of Bourbon against the Catholic League, which was headed by Henry I, Duke of Guise. Catherine turned to working once again with the House of Guise as she and her son, King Charles IX, strove to find a way to restore peace. In the aftermath of the massacre, King Charles's fragile mental and physical constitution weakened drastically. His mood swung from boasting about the extremity of the massacre to exclamations that the screams of the murdered Huguenots kept ringing in his ears. Frantically, he blamed alternately himself or his mother. His words of condemnation against his mother would later become the fuel for hatred against Catherine. Charles' physical condition, most likely TB, deteriorated to the point where, by the spring of 1574, his coughing turned bloody and his hemorrhages grew more violent. So it was that Charles IX died May 30th, 1574 at the age of 23. But Catherine had one more son left who was already a king. Catherine's son Henry III had left the country to reign in Poland, and upon the death of Charles, Catherine wrote to him to return to France to claim the French throne. More royal intrigue and machinations and more murder pursued with the new king Henry III in power. Alliances would shift, and eventually, it was all too much for the aging Serpent Queen who was approaching 70. Henry III was doing less to bring peace to the country and more to cement his power as King of France. Henry broke from Catherine's hold as Queen Regent and murdered members of the Guise family who were plotting against him. Catherine was devastated by her son's actions, so much so that it contributed to her failing health. She died on January 5, 1589, most likely from pleurisy. By that time, Paris was held by enemies of the crown, and the vitriol against Catherine began. It was written that when she died, she was treated with as much consideration as, get this, a dead goat. 8 months later, Henry III was stabbed to death and was preceded to the throne by his sister's husband, Henry of Navarre, to become Henry IV of France, who had this to say about Catherine. I ask you, what could a woman do, left by the death of her husband with 5 little children on her arms, and 2 families of France, the Guise and the Bourbons, who were thinking of grasping the crown? Was she not compelled to play strange parts, to deceive first one and then the other, in order to guard, as she did, her sons, who successively reigned through the wise conduct of that shrewd woman? I am surprised that she never did worse. It would be great if you leave comments below to let me know what you think about Catherine de Medici, the Serpent Queen, and if you would have done any differently. Thanks for watching.